The cruiser's overheads had been going for 22 minutes, and Ray Cutter still hadn't written anything down. He stood at the rear quarter panel of the white Nissan Sentra, one boot resting on the lip of the road's gravel shoulder, and he watched the woman in the driver's seat the way you watch a pot you're waiting to boil. He had her license on the roof of his cruiser. He hadn't called it in. The radio on his hip hissed occasionally with the dispatcher's voice handling some unrelated fender bender on the far side of the county, and he just let it hiss. The woman, Audrey Kessler, the name said on the license, had her hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the way they teach you in driver's ed and the way nobody actually drives. She put her hands there when she first saw the lights and she hadn't moved them. That told him something. It told him she was careful. It told him she'd thought about this moment before, whether consciously or not, and had decided that stillness was her best argument. He didn't like careful people. Careful people were witnesses. The sun was sitting low over the flat scrub of Burleson County, doing that thing it does in late September where the heat seems to come from everywhere at once, up from the asphalt, sideways off the dried creek beds, down through a sky the color of old brass. There were no other cars on County Road 227. There hadn't been any for a while. The cotton fields on either side were already past harvest, the stalks gray and skeletal, and a mockingbird somewhere was going through its whole catalog for no audience in particular. Cutter walked up to the driver's window again, second time. "Step out of the vehicle, please." She looked up at him. She had dark eyes that were careful too, the same as her hands. "You said you needed to check something on the registration." "Registration's fine, step out please." She didn't argue after that. She opened the door slowly, swung her legs out, stood beside the car without being told to move to the shoulder. She was wearing scrubs, the pale blue kind, the same shade nurses wear at the county hospital 15 miles east. She was maybe 5'4", slight, with her dark hair tied back in a way that said she'd done it in the parking lot of wherever she'd just come from. She stood with her arms loose at her sides and didn't look at the ground, which most people do. She looked at his face, steady and clear, and that was the thing about Audrey Kessler that Cutter would remember later after everything had unraveled. She looked directly at you, and it was the kind of looking that felt like it was storing information. "I'm going to conduct a routine vehicle search," he said. "Do you have probable cause?" "I smell something." She was quiet for a moment. "No, you don't." "Ma'am, I need you to stand here on the shoulder while I'd like to know what I was stopped for. Originally, you told me a headlight, but both my headlights are on. I checked when I got out." He looked at her with the expression he'd used for 19 years, flat, patient, giving nothing back. "Step to the shoulder, please." 3 weeks before that evening, a man named Derek Peel had sat across from Ray Cutter in a booth at the back of a diner called Lorne's on Highway 36. And Derek Peel had spread his hands on the laminate tabletop in the way that men do when they're about to tell you what they actually want. Cutter had known Derek for 11 years. They'd gone to the same church for about 4 of those years, back when Cutter was still married and still went to church. Derek Peel ran a bail bond office out of a converted insurance building in downtown Caldwell and had the kind of quiet prosperity that came from knowing people who owed him something. "I need you to sit on Marcus Webb," Derek had said. Marcus Webb was 38 years old, had a HVAC repair license, drove a tan Silverado, and had been in Audrey Kessler's life for going on 2 years. He had a cousin named Terrence who the DEA field office in Waco had on a wire, had been on that wire for 8 months building a distribution case that Cutter knew nothing about except what he'd heard secondhand from a guy at a department picnic. "Webb's not my problem," Cutter said. "He's moving weight through someone close to him, someone he trusts. I need that avenue closed." "You need it closed." The DEA finishes that Terrence Webb case, the whole network folds. That's 6 or 7 people who post bond with me after getting arrested. Now they walk on time served and federal plea deals and I don't see a dime. You follow the math. Cutter followed the math. He'd been following Derek Peel's math for 7 years, ever since he'd borrowed $14,000 to cover a period in his life he didn't like to think about. He'd paid that back. He'd paid it back twice over in favors and tips and occasional cooperation, but the debt had a way of recalculating itself when Derek needed something. "What do you mean, someone close to him?" Cutter said. Derek drank his coffee, looked out the window at the highway. Cutter understood then. He drove home that night and sat in his kitchen for a long time. He had a glass of water he didn't drink. The house was quiet in the way houses are when people used to live in them and then left. His ex-wife had taken most of the furniture and all of the warmth, and what remained felt like a staging area for a life he kept meaning to rebuild. His kids were in Austin with their mother. His older one, Brianna, was 16 now and called him maybe once a month. And when she called, she was polite in the way teenagers are when they've been taught that politeness is a kind of armor. He didn't think of himself as corrupt. He'd thought about that question carefully over the years he had genuinely, and he'd arrived at a conclusion that corruption was a word for people who acted out of pure greed or cruelty, and that wasn't him. He was a man maintaining order. He was a man who understood that the county's drug problems were real, and his department's resources were thin, and sometimes a push in the right direction was just efficiency. He told himself these things in the dark of his kitchen, and he almost believed them. Almost wasn't nothing, almost was something he'd learned to live with. Audrey Kessler had installed the dash cam on a Saturday morning in early September, in the parking lot of an O'Reilly Auto Parts on Highway 21. She'd done it herself with a YouTube video and a trim panel removal tool she borrowed from her neighbor, a retired electrician named Jean, who also lent her the circuit tester she used to wire the thing to the fuse box so it ran constantly, even when the car was parked. The camera was a Nextbase 522 GW, dual-channel, front-facing through the windshield, and a second lens mounted on the rearview mirror bracket that captured the cabin interior and rear window. She'd bought it because of the tailgating. She commuted 42 miles round-trip through Burleson and Lee counties to the hospital in Cameron, and there was a stretch of State Highway 36 where she'd been followed close, dangerously close, high beams in her mirror on 4 separate occasions over 3 months. She'd reported it to the sheriff's office once. A deputy had taken her information over the phone and given her a case number she'd never heard from again. She wasn't a conspiracy thinker, she wasn't, by nature, a suspicious person. The camera was practical. It was the same logic she applied to everything: identify the gap, fill the gap, move on. She hadn't thought much about the camera once it was installed. It sat above the rearview mirror like a small black brick, recording everything in a continuous loop that overrode itself every few days unless something triggered the G-sensor: impact, hard braking, sudden movement. She checked the footage once mostly to make sure it worked, and had watched a few minutes of ordinary Texas highway and found it about as interesting as watching paint cure. She went to work, she came home. She had dinner with Marcus twice a week and they watched television, and she helped him with his invoicing because he was bad with the administrative side of his business. And on weekends they sometimes drove down to the Fayette County lake and sat by the water without saying much, which she considered a kind of luxury she hadn't known was available until she'd been with Marcus. She did not know that Ray Cutter had been watching her parking lot at the hospital for 2 weeks. She did not know about Derek Peel, or the bail bond math, or the $14,000 debt that had been recalculating itself for 7 years. She did not know that Cutter had driven County Road 227 twice in daylight, noting its isolation, its lack of traffic cameras, its particular quality of emptiness. She did not know any of that when she saw the overheads come on in her rearview mirror at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in late September. When Cutter opened the rear driver's side door of the Sentra, he moved quickly. He'd been doing the job long enough to know that the window of time when a person is standing on the road shoulder, watching the back of your head while trying to look like they're not watching you, is maybe 45 seconds of genuine inattention. People can't sustain focused observation. Their eyes drift, their mind interprets and reinterprets. If you're competent and unhurried, you look like you're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing, which is examining the door panel and floor mat and the space under the seat. The baggie was small, a folded square of clear plastic containing maybe 1.2 grams of crystal methamphetamine, sealed with a single strip of clear tape. He'd carried it in the front left pocket of his uniform trousers inside a nitrile glove, worn, then folded back on itself, so his prints went nowhere near it. He placed it in the lower door pocket behind the fold of the weather seal, where it would require the kind of specific searching that he was now specifically performing. He straightened up and looked over the roof of the car at Audrey Kessler. "Ma'am, can you come over here, please?" She walked around the front of the car, hands still loose, looking at his face. He crouched and pointed into the door pocket. She stared at it for a long time, then she said, "That's not mine." "Can you tell me what it is?" "I don't know what it is, I've never seen it. It looks to me like a controlled substance." She was quiet. She had gone very still in a way that was different from the stillness earlier, which had been strategic. This was the stillness of a person processing something that doesn't process correctly, something that keeps returning wrong results no matter how many times you run it. "That is not mine," she said again. Her voice was flat, not raised. She was doing the work of keeping it flat, and he could see that work. He put on a fresh glove and picked up the baggie. He turned it in the late light. "I'm going to need to place you under arrest," he said. "Possession of a controlled substance pending lab analysis. I want to call someone." You'll have that opportunity at booking. She looked at him with those careful, storing eyes. She didn't say anything more, she didn't cry. She turned and put her hands behind her back without being asked, which was not what he'd expected, and that surprised him enough that he almost said something, some small acknowledgement, some human parenthetical, but he caught himself and just snapped the cuffs. What he would not know, not for 2 more weeks, was that when he'd opened the rear door of the Sentra, moving in that practiced, unhurried way, 45 seconds of performed ordinariness. The cabin camera mounted on the rearview mirror bracket had been recording at 30 frames per second in 1080p resolution with a field of view of 140 degrees. He'd been aware there was a dash cam, he'd seen the black unit on the windshield. What he'd calculated in the quick risk assessment he'd been running since he'd pulled her over was that a forward-facing dash cam covered the road ahead. It did not cover the interior. That was a reasonable assumption, and it was wrong. The G-sensor had triggered when he'd opened the rear door and the car body had flexed slightly. The footage had locked. It was no longer in the overwrite loop. He didn't know any of that when he put Audrey Kessler in the back of his cruiser, when he drove the 40 miles to the county jail in Caldwell, when he filled out the arrest report at the front desk with the particular efficiency of a man who had done this particular thing before, and when he got home that night and poured himself a glass of whiskey and watched a game he didn't care about until the whiskey and the hour put him to sleep in the chair. The county jail holding cell had a smell that Audrey would associate with that night for the rest of her life. Industrial disinfectant laid over something older and human and unwashable. There were 4 other women in the cell, 2 of them asleep on the metal benches, one very young and crying without any sound, the last one watching Audrey with the flat professional assessment of someone who'd been processed before. Audrey sat in the corner with her back against the painted cinder block, and she did not cry and she did not sleep, and she thought methodically about what she knew. She knew the baggie wasn't hers, that was the fix point. She thought about who else had been in her car. Marcus last Thursday when she'd driven them both to dinner because his truck was in the shop. Her coworker Tanya 2 Fridays ago for about 8 minutes while Audrey ran back into the hospital to grab her forgotten lunch bag. Gene the electrician briefly on the day she'd installed the camera, but he hadn't been in the back seat. She went through each of those people with the same methodical care she brought to logistics spreadsheets at work, and none of them resolved into something that made sense, because none of them used meth, not as far as she knew, and none of them were careless people. What she kept returning to was the deputy's face when he'd found the bag. Most people, when they find something unexpected, have a brief orienting expression, a micro moment of genuine surprise. They look at the thing, then at you, and there's a sequence, discovery, interpretation, response. She'd watched enough people at the hospital in moments of actual crisis to know what that sequence looked like. He hadn't had it, his face had been ready. The movement from crouching discovery to straightening announcement had been too smooth, too prepared, like a line read by someone who already knew where the scene was going. She turned that over and over in the dark of the holding cell while the fluorescent light above flickered its slow, indifferent rhythm. At 11 p.m. she was allowed her phone call. She called Marcus. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd already known something was wrong, which meant he'd been driving the county roads looking for her, which was, in the scale of that particular night, the closest thing to comfort she had. Cecilia Mora had a one-woman office above a hardware store on the courthouse square in Caldwell, and she had a reputation that was partly legend and partly accurate, which is the best kind of reputation for an attorney to have. She was 44, originally from San Antonio, and had spent 8 years at a civil rights firm in Austin before coming back to rural practice for reasons she described as complicated and rarely explained further. She had won 2 federal civil rights suits against Texas law enforcement in the past decade, one of which had settled for a number that bought a new gymnasium at the local elementary school, and she carried the institutional memory of those cases the way athletes carry old injuries, constantly, in ways that informed every movement. Marcus brought Audrey to Cecilia's office 48 hours after the arrest, after Audrey had made bail, after she'd gone home and showered and eaten something and slept 6 hours and woken up at 4 a.m. staring at the ceiling. He'd found Cecilia's name on a legal aid referral list and then Googled her separately and shown the results to Audrey, who'd read them carefully and said okay. Cecilia listened to Audrey's account of the traffic stop for 30 minutes without writing anything down. She sat behind a desk stacked with banker's boxes and held a coffee mug in both hands and listened the way people listen when they're mapping something, building the internal geography of a story. When Audrey finished, Cecilia said, "Do you still have the car?"
Yes.
Don't drive it, don't touch anything in it. What kind of dash cam? Next base, it's the dual channel kind, it has the cabin camera. There was a pause, something shifted in Cecilia's face, not dramatically, just a small recalibration, a door opening that she immediately thought about carefully before walking through. Where does it save footage? SD card in the unit. It overwrites after about a week unless the G-sensor locks it. Was the G-sensor triggered? I think so. He opened the rear door and I remember the car kind of shifted. I think that might trigger it. Cecilia set down the coffee mug. I'm going to call someone today. I need you to not touch the car, not let anyone else touch the car. Can you do that?
Yes.
And Audrey, she looked at her steadily. I need you to understand that even if the footage shows exactly what you're saying happened, this is a long road. It does not end next week. It probably doesn't end in 3 months, and it's going to be hard in ways that don't show up in the official record. Audrey looked back at her with the same direct, storing gaze. I understand, she said. The digital forensics specialist Cecilia used was a man named Paul Oak, who ran a data recovery and forensic imaging firm out of Brenham, and held a certificate from the International Association of Computer Investigative Specialists that he kept framed above his workstation with the same slightly ironic pride a restaurant might frame its first dollar. He was 36 precise and spoke about video files the way a watchmaker speaks about movements, with a deep affection for the internal logic of small mechanical things. He came to Audrey's house on a Saturday morning with a Pelican case and a laptop and a card reader. He extracted the SD card from the Nextbase unit without moving or touching any other part of the car, then sat on Audrey's porch in the autumn heat and worked for 2 hours while Audrey and Marcus sat inside. When he came in, he had an expression that was professionally neutral but not quite. The G-sensor locked the file, he said. It captured approximately 19 minutes. The cabin camera is centered on the rear window with a wide-angle lens. He turned the laptop so they could see the screen. The rear door opens at the 11-minute 42-second mark. The footage was clear in the center, softer at the edges where the wide-angle distorted. You could see the door open and Cutter's left arm and shoulder come into frame. The interior of the door pocket was at the lower right of the cabin camera's field of view, partially obscured by the geometry of the door itself, not fully visible but visible enough. You could see the hand, you could see the movement, you could see something, a small pale shape, go from the hand into the door pocket. It wasn't courtroom perfect. It wasn't a close-up from 3 angles with perfect lighting. It was 40% of what you needed and a strong argument for the other 60. Paul ran it forward and backward twice more. Then he said, I can do frame-by-frame analysis, stabilization, and luminance enhancement. I can produce a certified forensic report with chain of custody documentation. He paused. This is my opinion as a private examiner and not a law enforcement conclusion, but what this shows is consistent with an object being placed in the door pocket. Marcus stood up and walked into the kitchen. Audrey watched him go. Then she looked at Paul Oak and then at the frozen frame on the screen. Cutter's arm extended, the dark blur at the edge of the door pocket. How long will the analysis take, she said. 2 weeks for a full certified report. Can you start Monday? Cecilia filed the complaint with the Burleson County District Attorney's Office on a Wednesday, with a preliminary copy of Paul Oak's initial findings attached. The district attorney was a woman named Ellen Pritchard who'd been in office 3 years and had a productive but professionally distant relationship with the sheriff's department. She read Cecilia's submission that afternoon, called in her first assistant, and closed her office door for 45 minutes. Then she picked up the phone and called the Texas Rangers. The Rangers Company A out of Houston had a criminal investigations detachment in Bryan, 40 miles west, and the woman who answered that referral was Special Agent Dana Riley, who was assigned to public integrity cases and who, when Ellen Pritchard finished her summary, said simply, "Send me everything and I'll come Tuesday." Dana Riley drove a gray state-issued Taurus and dressed like a substitute teacher, slacks, button shirts, no obvious indicators of anything. She was 41, had been with the Rangers for 9 years, and before that had done 7 years with the Austin Police Department's Internal Affairs Unit. She had the kind of face that people consistently underestimated, not because it was plain but because it was patient, and people confused patience with passivity. She arrived in Caldwell on a gray October Tuesday, and spent the first day doing nothing that looked like an investigation. She drove the county roads. She ate lunch at Lorne's Diner and read the local paper and drank 2 cups of coffee and did not speak to anyone connected to the case. She drove County Road 227 twice at different times of day, noting the traffic patterns, the sight lines, the distance to the nearest residence or business with any possible view of the stop location. 0. There was nothing within a mile of where Cutter had pulled Audrey over that could have produced a witness. He'd chosen well. On Wednesday, she met with Cecilia Mora and reviewed the dash cam footage and Paul Oak's preliminary report. She asked 22 questions, made notes in a small notebook, and at the end said she wanted 3 things: Cutter's full arrest record for the past 5 years, the evidence chain of custody for the methamphetamine sample from Audrey's arrest, and access to the booking camera footage from the county jail on the night in question. She didn't explain what she was looking for with the arrest record. Cecilia didn't ask. It took Dana Riley 4 days to find the pattern. In 5 years of traffic stop arrests that had proceeded to prosecution, Cutter had 8 cases where the controlled substance had been found in a door pocket, console, or under a seat during a roadside vehicle search, rather than in the natural course of a stop where drugs were visible or smelled, or where the driver had been flagged on a prior warrant. 8 cases was not remarkable for an officer in his position. What was remarkable when Dana looked closer was the composition of those 8 defendants. 6 were women, 5 of those 6 had Hispanic or black surnames, 3 of them had no prior drug arrest record whatsoever, and 2 of them had filed complaints, small, quiet, going-nowhere complaints, against the Burleson County Sheriff's Department in the 2 years before their arrests. She pulled the evidence logs for those 8 cases. In 3 of them, the chain of custody documentation had gaps. Not unusual gaps, law enforcement evidence handling had gaps all the time. It was the nature of overstretched rural departments, but gaps in the same places near the same procedural moment, consistent in a way that was either coincidence or pattern. Dana Riley did not believe in coincidence the way she didn't believe in miracles, not as a matter of cynicism, just as a matter of professional habit. She opened a supplemental case file and began making calls. Cutter felt the trouble the way you feel a change in weather, not through any specific data point but through a general atmospheric shift. His 4th week after the Kessler arrest, he'd heard from Frankie Suggs, his occasional partner on evening shifts, that someone from the AG's office had been asking the property room clerk about evidence logs. Frankie had said it the way you say things you're not sure are important, offhand, over the hood of a cruiser in the parking lot like it might be nothing. But Frankie had said it. Cutter had worked with Frankie for 2 years. Frankie was 29, a decent officer, earnest in the way younger officers sometimes were before the job wore the earnestness into something more durable and less comfortable. He had a wife, a baby, and a mortgage on a small house outside of Snook. He was not inclined toward heroism or internal reporting, but he was also, Cutter understood, the kind of person who would react very badly to being made responsible for something he didn't do. The problem with Frankie was that Frankie had been in the cruiser the evening of the Kessler stop. He'd been on the radio with dispatch about the fender bender on the far side of the county, sitting in the cruiser with his feet on the dash, handling the other call while Cutter had conducted the search. He hadn't seen anything, but he was a witness to where they'd been and when, and if anyone came to ask him pointed questions, Cutter didn't know what Frankie would remember or imagine he'd seen. He drove past Audrey Kessler's house twice in November slowly in his personal vehicle. The Sentra was in the driveway, which meant she still had it, which meant she hadn't sold it or scrapped it. He didn't know why that detail mattered, but it sat in his chest like something that needed to be resolved. He stopped driving past the house after the second time because he recognized what he was doing and knew it would make things worse. He was not sleeping well. He ate badly. He went to work and did his job with the same competent ordinariness he'd maintained for 19 years, but the ordinariness felt now like a performance in a way it hadn't before. He looked at himself in the men's room mirror at the department and thought about who he was looking at, and came up with an answer that was honest enough to be uncomfortable and that he set aside with the practiced ease of long habit. He called Derek Peel once from a payphone at a gas station in Somerville just to establish that Derek should be quiet. "I'm always quiet," Derek said and hung up. That didn't help. Dana Riley interviewed Frankie Suggs in her car, parked at a rest stop off Highway 79 on a Thursday afternoon in early November. She'd identified him as Cutter's frequent partner, pulled his personnel record, and determined that he'd been on shift the evening of the Kessler stop. The interview was not recorded, which she told him up front, and she asked him to just walk her through that evening from his perspective. Frankie was quiet for about 30 seconds. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a plaid shirt because she'd asked him to meet her off-duty. He had a thermos of coffee that he turned over and over in his hands. "We got a call around 6 about a fender bender over on FM 1697, he said. "Ray was handling the stop on 227. I was on the radio working the fender bender from the car." "Were you watching him at any point?" "Not really. I mean, I could see that, he was over there with the car and I was on the radio. I wasn't watching." Did anything about that stop seem unusual to you afterward? Frankie turned the thermos over, set it down, picked it up again. He seemed satisfied, Frankie said. After, he seemed okay, more okay than usual. Dana wrote something in her notebook, more okay than usual. Ray's not a happy man, Frankie said. Not lately, it's just that's not an accusation, that's just a fact about him. That evening he was relaxed, like something had worked out. Had you ever seen him search a vehicle before that occasion? Sure, plenty of times. Did he generally find things? Frankie looked out the windshield. The rest stop had a grassy area with a picnic table where a family was eating lunch, 2 kids running in circles, completely ordinary, completely indifferent to the conversation happening 20 yards away. Sometimes, he said, more than average I guess, I always figured he just had good instincts. But, he looked at her, I didn't say but. No, she said, you didn't. She made another note. If you recall anything else from that evening, I'd like you to call this number. She handed him a card, specifically if you recall any detail of the vehicle search itself. Frankie took the card without looking at it. The forensic report from Paul Oak arrived in Cecilia's office on November 14, 41 pages, including frame-by-frame stills, luminance analysis, and a chain of custody certification. The key finding was on page 19, under the section heading Object Identification and Placement Analysis. The enhanced and stabilized frame showed Cutter's hand moving from above the door pocket downward at a rate inconsistent with a searching motion which sweeps, and consistent with a placement motion, which descends and withdraws. Oak had cross-referenced the physics of the motion against 11 comparison clips of officers legitimately searching door pockets, included as appendix material. He was careful. He did not say definitively that Cutter planted the drugs. He said that the footage was consistent with that conclusion to a degree of certainty he quantified at 78%, and that the alternative explanations, including that Cutter had been reaching to move an object, or that the camera angle had distorted a searching movement, were significantly less consistent with the available frames. 78% was not a slam dunk, it was the beginning of an argument. Cecilia sent the report to Dana Riley the same afternoon it arrived. Dana read it on her laptop in her hotel room in Bryan, eating a sandwich, stopping occasionally to look at the stills. She read it twice. Then she called Ellen Pritchard at home. We're going to need to talk about how to proceed, she said. I know, Pritchard said. I've been talking to the U.S. Attorney's Office. There was a beat. Federal, Dana said. Deprivation of civil rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Section 242. They're interested, but they want to see if we can build a stronger evidentiary record first. They don't want to move on footage alone. We have the pattern. The pattern is circumstantial. The footage is circumstantial. We need either a cooperating witness or something physical. Dana ate the last of her sandwich, thought for a moment. The meth itself, she said, if it came from a specific source and that source can be connected. Can you work that? I'm working it, she said. The methamphetamine from Audrey's arrest had been submitted to the DPS crime lab in Austin under standard processing. The lab had confirmed it as methamphetamine hydrochloride, 0.92 grams, which matched nothing unusual in its base composition. But the packaging, the folded clear plastic baggie with the clear tape seal, had been photographed by the evidence tech at booking, and when Dana requested those photographs and compared them to property room photographs from 3 of the other suspicious cases, she found something. The tape. It was the same tape in all 4 cases, a clear packing tape that was narrower than standard packing tape, about 3/4 of an inch wide. The cut pattern at the edges was distinctive, slightly ragged on one side, clean on the other, consistent with a handheld tape dispenser with a serrated blade on one side only. It was not the kind of thing that proved anything in isolation. It was the kind of thing that, combined with everything else, made a structure. Dana brought that to a meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Waco on a Monday in late November. She sat across from an AUSA named Harris Lim, who was 35 and had the particular focused energy of someone who picked cases very carefully and then worked them completely. She walked him through the full picture: the video, Oak's report, the pattern of arrests, the chain of custody gaps, the tape. Harris Lim listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Who's his handler at the department? He said. Who knows? I believe the sheriff knows something's off and has been looking away, I have nothing actionable on the sheriff. He's not a participant, he's just passive. The bail bondsman. Working that separately, he may be a separate indictment. Lim made a note. Give me one more piece, he said. Anything, witness, physical evidence, a statement, one more piece and I'll authorize an arrest. The one more piece came from a property room clerk named Denise Vogler, who'd worked in the Burleson County Sheriff's property room for 11 years and who, when Dana Riley sat across from her in a conference room at the DA's office with a recorder running and an immunity agreement on the table, folded her hands on the table and said, I knew something was wrong with some of his submissions, I just didn't know what I was supposed to do about it. She talked for 2 hours. She described 3 occasions over 5 years when Cutter had accessed the property room under circumstances that didn't match any active case, when he'd been logged in for 15 to 20 minutes handling items from the active evidence storage section. She'd never directly witnessed him taking or placing anything, but the access logs were there, and the timing of those accesses, cross-referenced with the dates of the suspicious arrests, put him in the property room handling controlled substances 1 to 3 days before each arrest. Where he was getting the drugs to plant, Dana now understood, was from the evidence room itself. Small skimmings from larger seizures, amounts below the threshold that would show up in weight discrepancies at the lab. A gram here, half a gram there, rebaggled, resealed with that narrow tape. It was elegant in the way small corruptions are elegant, not dramatic, just efficient. Years of accumulated small decisions that compounded into something that could end a person's life. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning, 12 days before Christmas, in the parking lot of the Burleson County Sheriff's Department on Lubbock Street in Caldwell. It was overcast, cold for Central Texas, 43 degrees, with a wind coming down from the north that moved through the bare oak trees along the courthouse square and made a dry, papery sound. Dana Riley was present but not prominent. She was in a gray Taurus in the far end of the lot, watching. The actual arrest team was 2 Rangers from Company F and 2 federal marshals, plainclothes, waiting in a dark blue Yukon parked beside the handicapped spaces. Cutter arrived at 8:12 a.m. in his personal truck, a black F-150 he'd owned for 6 years. He parked in his usual spot and sat in the truck for 2 minutes, long enough to check his phone, finish a cup of coffee from the cup in the console, and then he got out. He was in uniform, dark brown Burleson County Sheriff's Office shirt, tactical trousers, his badge and his service weapon on his belt. He looked like what he'd been for 19 years, a county law enforcement officer arriving for a shift. He looked like nothing had changed. The 2 Rangers stepped out from between parked vehicles when he was 10 feet from the department's rear entrance. One of them said his name, and the way they said it, not as a question, not with any force, just as a fact, stopped him completely. He turned, he looked at them. He looked at the federal marshals coming around the side of the Yukon. His face went through several things in about 3 seconds, and Dana, watching from the Taurus, would remember this. The first thing was not fear and not anger. It was something like resignation. As if he'd been waiting for this the way you wait for a bill you've been ignoring, not surprised by its arrival, just surprised the wait is finally over. Then something tightened in his face and he looked toward the back entrance of the department, where 2 uniformed deputies had come out to get some air, or use their phones, or whatever brought deputies out the back entrance at 8:12 in the morning. They were standing there watching now, coffee cups in hand, and whatever it was that crossed Cutter's face when he saw them, that was the thing Dana thought about for a long time after. He put his hands behind his back, he didn't say anything. One of the Rangers said the charges, the other one read him his rights. The federal marshal secured the handcuffs and guided him toward the Yukon, one hand on his elbow, and Cutter walked with his head down, not looking at the deputies by the back entrance, not looking at anything. Dana started the Taurus. She sat there with the engine running for a moment, watching the Yukon leave the lot. The 2 deputies stood at the back entrance holding their coffee cups, watching it go. The interrogation was in a federal building in Waco, the following Monday. Dana sat across from Cutter and his attorney, a private criminal defense lawyer named Goodall who'd driven up from Houston and who had the particular composed expression of someone billing at $500 an hour. Cutter looked different without the uniform. He was in a gray pullover and dark pants, and the absence of the badge and the belt reduced him in some way, not dramatically, not cruelly, just physically. He was 50 pounds of equipment lighter. Dana placed a manila folder on the table. She didn't open it. "Ray," she said. He looked at her. He'd been looking at the table, but he looked at her when she said his name without the title. "I've been in law enforcement for 16 years, she said. "I want to be straightforward with you about what we have so you can make the best decision for yourself." Goodall put his hand on Cutter's arm. "My client will." "I know what he'll do," Dana said calmly. "I'm not asking him to say anything. I'm going to tell him what we have and then we're going to stop." She opened the folder. She put the stills from the dash cam footage on the table, 6 of them in sequence. Then the evidence log pages with the property room access times circled in red. Then the photograph comparisons of the tape from 4 separate arrests. Cutter looked at each one. His face was contained, like a man reading bad news in a doctor's office who has already half expected the diagnosis. "We have a cooperating witness from the property room," Dana said. "We have the U.S. Attorney's Office in Waco and we have federal civil rights charges pending. What you're looking at right now is a floor, not a ceiling." She paused. "I don't want you to respond to that, I just want you to understand the shape of the situation." She closed the folder. The room was quiet. The building's ventilation system made a low, steady sound. Outside, through the single high window, the sky was the color of old paper. "Is she all right?" Cutter said. Goodall looked at him sharply. Dana waited. "Kessler," he said, how is she doing?" It was the last thing Dana expected him to say. She looked at him for a moment, trying to read what was in it, whether it was strategic or genuine or some combination that even he couldn't untangle, and she concluded that it didn't matter what it was. He had asked it. That was its own answer. "Her charges were dropped in October," Dana said. "She lost her job while the charges were pending. She's trying to get it back." Cutter nodded once. He looked at the closed folder. He didn't say anything else. The federal indictment came down in February. 18 counts, deprivation of rights under color of law, obstruction, 3 counts related to evidence tampering in prior cases that had been identified in the expanding investigation. Derek Peel was separately indicted on conspiracy charges the same week, in a filing that had 3 pages of billing records from his bond office attached as exhibits. Sheriff Bud Hewitt announced his retirement 2 days after the Cutter indictment, citing health reasons, which was technically not a lie. He'd had a hypertension diagnosis 2 years earlier that he'd been managing with medication. Nobody in Caldwell believed the health reasons were the whole story, but nobody said so in a way that produced legal consequences, and the sheriff retired to a house outside of College Station and was not indicted. Cecilia Mora filed the civil rights lawsuit against Burleson County on Audrey's behalf in March. It was not a dramatic filing. It was 43 pages of thorough, well-documented argument, and the county's insurance carrier, upon reviewing it, declined to contest in a way that suggested they'd looked at the same 43 pages and come to their own conclusions. 3 of the 8 women Dana's investigation had flagged as likely victims of prior plantings had their convictions vacated. 1 had served 14 months. 2 had accepted plea deals that were now voided. The process of vacating those convictions was slow and bureaucratic, and each one required separate filings and hearings, and what felt like a disproportionate amount of official energy directed at correcting things that should never have happened. None of those women appeared in newspaper articles. The newspaper articles were about Cutter and Derek Peel and the indictment and what it meant for public trust in the sheriff's department. The women themselves were sources of 1 or 2 quoted sentences. "I always knew I was innocent," or "I just want to move on," and then the articles moved on from them too, in the way that articles about systems do, gravitating toward the architecture and away from the people inside it. Cutter pleaded guilty in August to 3 counts of federal civil rights violations and 1 count of evidence tampering. He received a sentence of 4 years and 2 months in federal custody, with the understanding that additional state charges would run concurrently. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked. His pension, under Texas law, was substantially reduced, the calculation governed by a statute that parsed the degree to which the misconduct was committed in the course of official duties, which in this case was all of it. He was processed out of the county jail the morning he was transferred to federal custody, and the processing was ordinary: paperwork, inventory of personal effects, a clear plastic bag with his watch and his wallet and his phone and the keys to the black F-150 that would sit in his impound-adjacent driveway, accumulating county parking notices for the next 6 weeks, until his daughter drove down from Austin and made arrangements. Dana Riley drove back to Bryan the afternoon of the sentencing. She stopped at a gas station on Highway 290 and bought a bottle of water and a bag of peanuts and stood outside in the November air eating them, watching the traffic. She called her supervisor to confirm the file was closed, which it was, pending the Peel case. She drove home. She had 3 other open cases on her desk and she thought about them on the drive, running through what she needed to do Monday morning. And by the time she got to Brian, she had a list of about 7 things and she was thinking about dinner. Audrey got her job back in January, not at the Cameron Hospital, which had filled her position while the charges were pending, but at a clinic in Bryan, 30 minutes closer to home, doing intake and logistics for a multi-provider family practice. The commute was easier. The pay was roughly the same. She and Marcus were together technically, but the months of the case had put a texture on things that hadn't been there before. It wasn't anybody's fault. It was more like the way that being in a car accident with someone changes the way you sit in a car with them. The knowledge of what can happen is always present quietly at the edge of every ordinary moment. They still went to the lake on weekends sometimes. They still sat by the water. They talked more than they used to, which was either healing or just a different way of being quiet. Cecilia Morris settled the civil suit in April for a number that was not disclosed publicly, per the terms of the agreement. It was not, as Cecilia explained to Audrey in her office the day they signed the papers, justice in any precise sense of the word. Justice implied a clean accounting, a correct answer arrived at through proper process. What this was settlement. An acknowledgement in the language of money that something wrong had happened and that the county bore responsibility for the conditions that allowed it. Audrey listened to that, she nodded. I know, she said. I want to make sure you're okay with the amount, Cecilia said, if you want to push further. I'm okay with it. She looked out Cecilia's window at the courthouse square below, the old limestone courthouse with its Texas flag, the live oaks, the coffee shop across the street with the hand-painted sign. She'd driven past that courthouse her whole life. She'd grown up 3 miles from it. It had always been a kind of background architecture, the way the water tower was or the grain elevators on the highway, something that organized the landscape without requiring much thought. She thought about it more now. She wasn't sure whether that was a loss or a different kind of attention, and she didn't try to resolve it. On a Thursday in May, she drove County Road 227 for the first time since the arrest. She hadn't planned to. She'd taken a wrong turn off FM 141 trying to avoid a traffic backup on the highway, and the road had appeared the way things from your past appear, suddenly, with the quiet authority of something that had always been there. The cotton was coming in early that year, short and green, not yet to height. The sky was white with high, thin clouds. She drove at exactly the posted limit, 55, and the road was empty in both directions. She passed the spot without slowing down. She knew it by the shape of the shoulder, the way the gravel widened slightly on the right side where cruisers sometimes pulled. There was no marker, no reason for any marker. It was just a piece of Texas county road, flat and open and endlessly ordinary, and the mockingbirds and the cotton and the white sky had no memory of what had happened there at all. She drove on. At the end of the road where it teed into State Highway 36, she stopped at the sign, looked left, then right. The highway stretched in both directions into the particular sameness of Central Texas in May, flat, green, present. She turned right and drove toward home. And